The rain came down in sheets that October morning, turning the parking lot of the Millbrook County Sheriff's Department into a mirror of gray sky and flashing red and blue lights. Detective Sarah Chun stood at the window of the second-floor conference room, watching as deputies led a man in handcuffs through the downpour. She couldn't see his face from this angle, only the silver of his hair darkened by rain, the expensive wool coat now soaked through, the way his shoulders seemed to carry the weight of 26 years in a single moment. "That's him?" asked Deputy Marcus Webb, standing beside her with a coffee cup trembling slightly in his hands. Marcus had been with the department for 15 years, had seen his share of arrests, but this one was different. This one reached back into history, into the fabric of their small Indiana town, into wounds that had never properly healed. "That's him," Sarah confirmed, her voice steady despite the hammer of her own heartbeat. "Thomas Whitmore, 63 years old. Owned Whitmore Construction for 40 years. Little League coach, Rotary Club member. And according to the DNA evidence we just received, the man who killed Nora Gray on November 14, 1998. The name hung in the air like smoke. Nora Gray. Even Marcus, who had been barely out of high school when it happened, knew that name. Everyone in Millbrook knew it. The 17-year-old honor student who had disappeared after her shift at the Riverside Diner. The girl whose body had been found 3 days later in Blackwood Forest, 17 miles from town. Her life stolen in an act of violence that had never made sense to anyone who knew her. Sarah had been 12 years old in 1998, living 2 streets over from the Gray family. She remembered the search parties, the way her mother had gripped her hand tighter when they walked anywhere, the memorial service where Nora's mother had collapsed against the closed casket. She remembered something else too, the way the case had consumed Detective Raymond Price, the lead investigator who had worked it until his retirement in 2015. Ray had died 2 years ago, never knowing the answer to the question that had haunted him for 17 years of active duty. "Does the family know?" Marcus asked quietly. "Sheriff's with them now. Diane Gray and her son, Michael. He was Nora's younger brother, would have been 9 when it happened." Sarah turned from the window, facing the conference table where files were spread out like pieces of a puzzle finally coming together. Crime scene photos from 1998 yellowed with age, evidence logs, witness statements, and in the center the new DNA report that had changed everything. The door opened and Sheriff Tom Brennan entered, his face showing every one of his 58 years. He'd been a deputy back in '98, had been part of those search parties, had held the line when reporters swarmed their small department demanding answers they didn't have. "They're processing him downstairs," Tom said, removing his hat and setting it on the table. "Miranda Wright's red," lawyer called. "It's really happening." "How did Diane take it?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer would be complicated. There was no simple reaction to learning that the man who killed your daughter had been living in the same town for 26 years, had probably passed you in the grocery store, had been at community events, had lived a full life while your daughter remained 17 forever. She didn't say much, just sat there holding this photo. Tom pulled out his phone, showed Sarah the image he'd taken with Diane's permission. It was a picture of a picture. Nora in her high school volleyball uniform, mid-jump, face alight with joy and competition and the kind of unself-conscious confidence that comes from being young and strong and unaware that time might be short. Sarah had seen this photo before in the case files, in newspaper articles, on the memorial bench at Riverside Park. But seeing it now, on the day of an arrest, it hit different. Nora Gray wasn't just a cold case anymore. She was a daughter getting justice, finally, even if that justice came too late for her mother to feel anything resembling peace. "What broke it?" Marcus asked, gesturing at the files. "After all this time, what changed?" Sarah sat down, pulling the DNA report toward her. Genealogical DNA database. Whitmore's niece uploaded her DNA to one of those ancestry websites 3 months ago, looking for relatives, building a family tree. The database flagged a familial match to the DNA we recovered from under Nora's fingernails. She fought him. Even at 17, even scared, she fought. The room fell quiet. Outside, thunder rumbled across the October sky. "We ran it up the chain, got a warrant for Whitmore's DNA based on the familial match," Sarah continued. 2 weeks ago, we collected his coffee cup from the Rotary Club meeting. He's creature of habit, always gets the large Colombian blend, drinks it black. Sent it to the state lab with a rush order. Results came back yesterday at 4:30 in the afternoon. 99.9% match to the DNA from Nora's fingernails. 26 years, Tom said, shaking his head. He's been here the whole time. His company built half the new developments in this county. He coached my nephew in baseball. He was questioned back in '98, Sarah said, flipping through the old case files until she found the interview transcript. November 20th, 6 days after Nora disappeared. Detective Price brought him in because his construction company was working on a project near where Nora's car was found. Whitmore said he was home that night with his wife, Catherine. She confirmed it. He seemed cooperative, even concerned. Price cleared him, moved on to other leads. The wife lied for him, Marcus said, his voice hard. Or she didn't know. Catherine Whitmore died in 2003. Cancer. Maybe she really believed he was home. Maybe he was home most of the night, just not all of it. Sarah closed the file. We'll never know now, but we know the DNA doesn't lie. Tom walked to the window, looking down at the same scene Sarah had watched minutes before. The patrol cars were pulling away now, taking Thomas Whitmore to county lockup. I need to call Ray's daughter, he said quietly. He'd want to know. Even if he can't hear it anymore. Somehow, I think he'd want to know. Sarah understood. Cold cases were ghosts that haunted departments, investigators, entire communities. They were the questions without answers, the justice delayed until it seemed like justice would never come. Raymond Price had carried Nora Gray's case like a stone in his pocket for 17 years. He'd reviewed it quarterly even after other detectives told him to let it go, that they'd done everything they could. He'd maintained a relationship with Diane Gray, calling her every year on Nora's birthday, on the anniversary of her death, just to let her know she wasn't forgotten. There's something else, Sarah said, pulling out another folder. This one was newer, its contents more recent. When we started looking into Whitmore after the DNA match came back, we found something. In May of 1998, 6 months before Nora was killed, a girl named Rebecca Stokes reported a sexual assault. She was 19, worked at the campus bookstore at Millbrook College. She told police that a man in his late 30s, driving a dark blue truck, offered her a ride when her car broke down on County Road 14. She accepted. He drove her to a remote area and attacked her. She managed to escape, got away through the woods. Let me guess, Marcus said. Whitmore drove a dark blue truck. Ford F-150, 1996 model. He still owns it, keeps it in his garage under a tarp. Sarah opened the folder, revealing a photo of a young woman with dark hair and frightened eyes giving a statement to police. Rebecca gave a description, but it was vague, it was dark, she was traumatized. The case went nowhere. She transferred to a different college the next semester, left town, and the investigation stalled. You think Nora wasn't his first, Tom said. I think Nora fought back harder than he expected. I think there's a reason her DNA was under his fingernails and his was under hers. Rebecca got away. Nora almost did. Sarah's voice was steady, but her hands had curled into fists on the table. I've already put in a call to Rebecca Stokes. She lives in Oregon now, married, 2 kids, works as a nurse. She's willing to testify if we need her. The door opened again, and a young woman in a deputy's uniform entered, holding a cardboard evidence box. Detective Chan, you asked for the original evidence from the Gray case. I pulled it from archives. Thank you, Deputy Morrison. Sarah took the box, setting it carefully on the table. The seal was intact, the chain of custody documentation attached to the side. She broke the seal with practiced care, opening the box to reveal plastic evidence bags, each one tagged and dated. November 17th, 1998. Nora's clothing carefully preserved. The gold locket she'd been wearing, a gift from her grandmother. A small notebook found in her car, filled with sketches. Nora had dreamed of being an artist, had been planning to apply to art schools that winter, and a single earring, the mate to which had never been found. We held on to everything, Tom said. Even after the case went cold, even after most people stopped talking about it. We held on because we knew this day might come. We knew someone, somewhere, might remember something, might come forward, might make a mistake. Sarah lifted the evidence bag containing the locket, holding it up to the fluorescent light. She could see the engraving on the back, tiny letters, NRG Dream Big. Nora Rose Gray, 17 years old, a senior at Millbrook High School, captain of the volleyball team, member of the art club, volunteer at the animal shelter, daughter, sister, friend, someone who'd had a whole life ahead of her, a future full of possibilities, until Thomas Whitmore had stolen it all in one brutal act on a November night in 1998. What's the DA saying? Marcus asked. Murder in the first degree. The evidence is solid DNA, the timeline matches, and we've got the prior assault attempt to establish pattern of behavior. Millbrook hasn't seen a trial like this in decades. Sarah carefully returned the locket to the box. This is going to tear the town apart. Half of them will remember Nora and want justice. The other half will remember Tom Whitmore as their neighbor, their business associate, their coach, and they won't want to believe it. Truth doesn't care what people want to believe, Tom said firmly. We've got the science, we've got the evidence, and we've got a duty to that girl and her family. That's all that matters. But Sarah knew it wasn't that simple. Nothing ever was. She'd lived in Millbrook her entire life, had seen how the town worked, how secrets festered, how the past and present tangled together like roots beneath the ground. Thomas Whitmore wasn't just any man. He was connected, respected, embedded in the community's infrastructure. His arrest would send shockwaves through every family, every business, every friendship that had intersected with his life over the past 6 decades. And somewhere in Millbrook, Diane Gray was sitting with that photo of her daughter, finally learning the name of the man who'd made her a mother without a child to hold. Nora Gray had always been an early riser, even on Saturdays. In the autumn of 1998, she'd taken to watching the sunrise from her bedroom window, a ritual she'd started that September when senior year began and everything suddenly felt both infinite and terrifyingly finite. She would sit cross-legged on the window seat her father had built when she was 12, a mug of tea cooling in her hands, and watch as the darkness over Millbrook gave way to shades of amber and rose. Her mother, Diane, would often find her there during those early morning hours, lost in thought or sketching in one of her many notebooks. You're going to be exhausted by third period, Diane would say, but without much conviction. She understood her daughter's need for these quiet moments, these pockets of solitude before the day began demanding things of her. Nora's room was a reflection of her internal contradictions. The wall above her desk covered with college brochures for art programs in Chicago, Seattle, New York, but her bookshelf dominated by AP biology and calculus textbooks because her father had gently suggested that art is wonderful, honey, but maybe something to fall back on. The contradiction bothered her less than it probably should have. Nora had learned early how to hold multiple versions of herself in the same space. The serious student, the competitive athlete, the dreamer who filled sketchbooks with charcoal drawings of abandoned barns, and the way light fell through autumn leaves. You contain multitudes. Her English teacher, Mrs. Patterson, had written on her essay about Walt Whitman. Nora had kept that paper, pinned it to her bulletin board alongside volleyball tournament schedules and her work schedule at the Riverside Diner. The diner, that's where much of her life happened that fall, for shifts a week after school and on weekends, serving coffee to farmers who came in at 5 in the morning and to families after church on Sunday. She'd worked there since the summer after her sophomore year, initially just for spending money, but by senior year, she'd been saving for college, for art supplies, for the future that stretched before her like an unmapped country. Her boss, Linda Mercer, ran the diner with efficiency and warmth in equal measure. Linda had 3 kids of her own, all grown now, and she treated her younger employees with a mix of maternal care and no-nonsense pragmatism. Nora, honey, table 6 needs refills, and if I see you doodling on napkins during your shift one more time, I'm going to start charging you for supplies, she'd say, but she'd be smiling, and Nora would notice later that Linda had saved some of those napkin sketches, tucked them into her office drawer. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The regulars loved Nora. Old Mr. Henderson, who came in every Tuesday and Thursday at 7 a.m. sharp, would always ask to sit in her section. He ordered the same thing: scrambled eggs, wheat toast, coffee, and he'd leave her articles he'd clipped from magazines about art schools or young artists making names for themselves. "Thought you might be interested," he'd say gruffly, as if it was nothing, as if he hadn't spent time thinking about her future. Then there was the Everett family, Mark and Susan and their 3 children, who came in after church most Sundays. The youngest, Emma, had decided Nora was the most glamorous person in Millbrook, and would draw her pictures that Nora would tape to the employee break room wall. For the gallery, Nora would say seriously and Emma would beam, but not everyone was kind. There was a darkness that lived in the corners of small-town life, a casual cruelty that manifested in small ways. Some of the boys from school, the ones who peaked in high school and somehow already knew it, would come into the diner late on Friday nights, ordering too much food they wouldn't eat, leaving messes, making comments just loud enough for Nora to hear but just quiet enough that calling them out would seem like an overreaction. "Hey, Nora, you working hard or hardly working?" Chad Brennan would call out, and his friends would laugh like it was the height of comedy. "Still painting pictures of flowers and shit?" Ryan Walker would add. "That's cute. Real practical." Nora had learned to smile tightly, to take their orders efficiently, to not engage. She'd learned that defending herself would only make it worse, that the best strategy was to be professional, get them in and out, and wash away the grimy feeling of their attention with soap and water in the break room afterward. "You don't have to take that," Linda would say, but they both knew the reality. In a small town, refusing service to the wrong people could create problems that rippled outward. Chad's father sat on the school board. Ryan's uncle was friends with the mayor. Millbrook operated on invisible networks of loyalty and obligation that predated anyone's memory. Nora's best friend, Cassie Morgan, worked at the diner too, had started the same summer. They'd known each other since kindergarten, had been inseparable through the particular trials of growing up female in a town of 8,000 people. Cassie wanted to be a veterinarian, was planning to go to Purdue, and she balanced her college applications with Saturday shifts and volleyball practice with the kind of determined efficiency that made adults nod approvingly and say things like, "That girl's going places. I don't understand how you can stand those assholes," Cassie said one October evening, as they cleaned tables after the dinner rush. Through the windows, the light was fading to purple, and the first stars were appearing in the cold sky. "I imagine them 20 years from now," Nora said, wiping down the counter with methodical strokes. "Still here, still peeking, telling stories about their glory days while the world moves on without them. And I imagine me somewhere else, Chicago, maybe, or New York, in a gallery showing my work or teaching art to kids who actually want to learn. That makes it easier." "You're going to do that," Cassie said with conviction. "You're going to get out and do amazing things. We both are. Promise we'll stay friends?" Nora asked, and she hated how young her voice sounded, how vulnerable. "When we're scattered across different states, living different lives?" "Obviously," Cassie said, bumping her shoulder against Nora's. "We're going to be those cool friends who meet up in different cities, who call each other when life gets weird, who show up at each other's weddings and embarrass each other with childhood stories." They'd laughed then, 2 17-year-old girls planning futures they believed were inevitable, mapping out lives they were certain would unfold according to some benevolent plan. Neither of them could have imagined that in less than a month, one of those futures would end before it properly began. At home, Nora's younger brother Michael was 9 years old and worshipped her with the particular intensity of younger siblings. He'd wait for her to get home from work, no matter how late, just to tell her about his day: the soccer game at recess, the science project on volcanoes, the girl in his class who was mean to everyone but who he suspected might be dealing with something hard at home because he'd learned from Nora to look for the why beneath people's behavior. "You're going to be a good man," Nora would tell him, ruffling his hair as they sat at the kitchen table, sharing the cookies their mother had baked. "You're going to be the kind of person who makes the world a little less terrible. Like you," Michael would say, and Nora would feel the weight of that admiration, the responsibility of being someone's hero. Their father, David Gray, worked at the Millbrook post office, had for 23 years. He was a quiet man, thoughtful, the kind of person who listened more than he spoke. He'd been the one to first notice Nora's artistic talent, had bought her her first real set of charcoal pencils when she was 13, had built her that window seat so she'd have a place to create and think. "Your mother worries about the art school thing," he told Nora one evening in October, a week before everything changed. They were in the garage, where he'd been organizing tools, and Nora had come out to ask if he wanted tea. "She worries it's not practical, that you'll struggle financially." "I know," Nora said. "But I think," David continued, selecting his words carefully, "that there are different kinds of poverty, and spending your life doing something that doesn't feed your soul, that's its own kind of poverty. So if you want to go to art school, if that's really what you want, I'll support you. We'll figure out the money. We'll figure it out." Nora had hugged him then, and he'd held her like she was still small, still his little girl, even though she was 17 now, nearly grown, nearly gone. Diane Gray worked part-time at the elementary school library, a job she loved because it kept her connected to books and to children and to the rhythms of the school year that had structured her life since becoming a mother. She worried about Nora constantly, the way all mothers worry, but especially that fall, as college application deadlines approached and her daughter seemed poised on the edge of something, ready to fly away to a life that wouldn't include daily breakfasts together or the sound of her voice calling, "Mom, have you seen my volleyball shoes?" "She's going to be fine," David would tell his wife at night, when Diane's worry spiraled into what-ifs and worst-case scenarios. "She's smart and strong and good. The world is going to welcome her." But Diane had dreams sometimes, anxious dreams where she'd lost something precious and couldn't remember what it was, where she'd searched through familiar rooms that had somehow become strange. She'd wake from these dreams with her heart racing and would pad quietly to Nora's room just to see her sleeping, to confirm that she was there, safe, real. The week before November 14th, Nora had been working on her college application essay. The prompt asked her to write about a challenge she'd overcome and what it had taught her. She'd written about the volleyball championship her sophomore year, when she'd torn a ligament in her ankle but had played through the pain anyway, leading her team to victory. But reading it back, she'd been dissatisfied. "It's too obvious," she told Cassie during their lunch break at school. They sat on the gymnasium steps, eating sandwiches from home, watching other students pass by in their own separate worlds. "Everyone writes about sports injuries or whatever. I want to write something true." "So write something true," Cassie said. "Write about what it's actually like to be 17 in a town that feels too small, about trying to figure out who you are when everyone already thinks they know who you should be." Nora considered this. "That's harder to write. The true things always are." So Nora had started over, writing late into the night on November 13th, sitting at her desk with her lamp casting a pool of warm light in the darkness. She wrote about contradiction and expectation, about loving her small town and desperately needing to leave it, about the fear that she might not be brave enough or talented enough or special enough to make it in the wider world. She wrote about her brother looking at her like she had answers, about her parents' careful hopes, about the version of herself she was trying to become and the version she was afraid she'd always be. It was good. She knew it was good. She saved the document, titled Draft, Nora Gray, Personal Essay, and planned to polish it over the weekend. She'd have time after her shift at the diner on Friday night. November 14th, 1998. The day started like so many others. Sunrise watched from the window seat. Tea that grew cold as she sketched. Her mother's voice calling up the stairs. "Nora, breakfast." The familiar rhythm of school. Classes that felt simultaneously crucial and pointless. Lunch with Cassie where they rated the cafeteria's attempts at edible food. Volleyball practice where Coach Simmons pushed them hard because regionals were coming up. After practice, Nora had rushed home, showered quickly, grabbed a granola bar for dinner. She had the closing shift at the diner that night, 6 to midnight. Linda had asked if she could work it because the usual closer, Janice, had a family emergency. "You're a lifesaver," Linda had said when Nora agreed. "I'll make it up to you, promise." Diane had been worried about Nora driving home so late. It was a 15-minute drive from the diner to their house, mostly along dark county roads with no streetlights. "Maybe Dad should pick you up," she'd suggested. "Mom, I'm 17. I have to be able to drive home from work." Nora had been patient but firm. I'll call when I'm leaving, okay? You can track my progress if it makes you feel better. So Diane had reluctantly agreed, because what choice did she have? Her daughter was growing up, becoming independent, and you couldn't protect someone forever, even though every instinct screamed to try. The shift had been busy. Friday nights always were. Families coming in for fish fries, teenagers gathering in booths to gossip and flirt. The peculiar energy of a small town on the edge of the weekend. Nora had been efficient, friendly, professional. She'd handled Chad Brennan and his friends when they'd come in around 9. Had ignored their leering comments and their too loud laughter. Had collected their 20% tip with a practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes. Mr. Henderson had been there too, at his usual table even though it was Friday instead of his regular Tuesday or Thursday. Couldn't sleep, he'd explained. Figured I might as well have pie somewhere other than my kitchen. They talked for a while. Nora had the kind of face that made people want to tell her things, to share their worries and their stories. Mr. Henderson had talked about his late wife. How this time of year was hard because they'd been married in November, 43 years before cancer had taken her. Nora had listened, had refilled his coffee, had said the kinds of things that couldn't fix anything but that acknowledged the shape of his grief. You're going to do good things, Mr. Henderson had told her as he'd left around 11, pressing a $5 bill into her hand even though his pie had only cost $2.50. You've got a good heart, Nora Gray. Don't let the world make you hard. She'd been touched, had tucked the bill into her pocket along with the rest of her tips, had watched him leave through the diner's glass doors, his old Buick pulling out of the parking lot and disappearing down Main Street. The last customers left at 11:30. Linda had already gone, trusting Nora to close up. She'd done it dozens of times before. Nora had cleaned tables, had run the vacuum, had counted the register and filled out the deposit slip. She'd locked up at 11:55, stepping out into the November cold, her breath visible in the air. The parking lot was mostly empty. Just her car, a 1994 Honda Civic her parents had bought her for her 16th birthday, and one truck parked at the far end, near the dumpsters. A dark blue Ford F-150. She'd noticed it earlier but hadn't thought much of it. People parked there sometimes. Nora had gotten into her car, had locked the doors immediately, a habit her father had insisted on, and had started the engine. She'd pulled out her phone to call her mother, to let her know she was heading home, but the battery was dead. She'd forgotten to charge it. Shit, she'd muttered. But it wasn't a big deal. She'd just call from home. It was only 15 minutes. She'd pulled out of the parking lot, turning onto County Road 14, heading north toward home. The road was dark, lined with bare trees that looked like skeleton hands against the starlit sky. Her headlights cut through the darkness, and the radio played low. She'd been listening to a mixed CD Cassie had made her, a collection of songs they'd loved that fall. She'd been singing along to Sarah McLachlan's Angel when her car had sputtered, once, twice, and then died. No, 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 Nora had chanted, trying to restart it, pumping the gas pedal the way her father had shown her, but nothing. The engine wouldn't turn over. She'd been about 7 miles from town, 3 miles from the nearest house. This was before cell phones were ubiquitous, before GPS could pinpoint your location. Her phone was dead anyway. She'd sat there in the dark for a moment, considering her options. She could wait, hope someone would come along. But it was nearly midnight on a Friday in November. Traffic on this road was minimal even during the day. She could start walking, but 3 miles in the dark, in her work shoes in the cold, that wasn't appealing. And then headlights had appeared in her rearview mirror. A truck, slowing down, pulling up behind her. The dark blue Ford F-150 from the diner parking lot. Relief had flooded through her. Someone stopping to help. This was the Midwest, after all. This was what people did. The driver had gotten out, walked up to her window. She'd rolled it down a crack, cautious but not yet afraid. Car trouble? He'd asked. He'd been in his late 30s, wearing a work coat, his face pleasant and concerned in the cast of his headlights. She'd recognized him vaguely, someone from town, though she couldn't place exactly where she knew him from. It just died, Nora had explained. I don't know what's wrong. I'm really not far from home. I live just a few miles up the road. I don't suppose you have a phone I could use. I do, he'd said. But there's no service out here. Tell you what, I'm heading that direction anyway. Why don't I give you a ride home? You can call a tow truck from there. Deal with the car in the morning. Nora had hesitated. Everything she'd ever been taught about stranger danger, about not getting into cars with people she didn't know, had risen up in warning. But he wasn't really a stranger, was he? She'd seen him around town. He looked normal, respectable. And the alternative was sitting in her dead car in the cold, waiting for someone else to come along who might be worse. Okay, she'd said, making a decision that would cost her everything. Thank you. That's really kind. She'd gathered her backpack, her jacket, had locked her car and followed him to his truck, had climbed into the passenger seat, noting the smell of sawdust and coffee, the construction company logo on the door, Whitmore Construction. That's where she knew him from. His company had done work on the school, had built houses in the new development near the park. He was legitimate, respected. This was fine. She was being paranoid for nothing. I'm Tom, he'd said, pulling back onto the road. Tom Whitmore. Nora, she'd replied. Nora Gray. Thank you again for stopping. I really appreciate it. They'd driven for maybe a mile, making small talk about the diner, about the construction business, about the early winter cold. And then he'd turned off County Road 14, taking a side road Nora didn't recognize. This isn't the way to my house, she'd said. And for the first time, real fear had crept into her voice. I know a shortcut, he'd said, but his tone had changed. Something underneath the words now. Something that made every alarm in Nora's body start screaming. Actually, I'd rather take the main road, she'd said, trying to keep her voice steady. If you could just. You're a pretty girl, Nora Gray, he'd said, and the way he said her name made her skin crawl. Noticed you at the diner tonight. Noticed you before that too. Nora's hand had gone to the door handle, but he'd hit the locks. They'd clicked shut with a sound like a prison gate closing. Let me out, she'd said, her voice rising. Let me out right now. But he hadn't. He'd driven deeper into the darkness, onto roads that became dirt, then barely roads at all. And when he'd finally stopped, when he'd reached for her, Nora had fought. She'd fought like her life depended on it, because it did. She'd clawed at his face, his hands, had screamed even though there was no one to hear. She'd managed to get the door open, had run into the darkness of Blackwood Forest, had run until her lungs burned and her legs gave out. But he'd been bigger, stronger, and he'd caught her. The last thing Nora Gray thought about, as her life ended at 17 in a forest 17 miles from home, was her mother's face. The way Diane smiled when Nora came into a room. The way she'd worry, waiting for a phone call that would never come. The morning of November 15, 1998, started normally for Diane Gray. She woke at 6:30, as she always did, and lay in bed for a moment listening to the house. David was already in the shower. She could hear the pipes groaning, and she could hear Michael's alarm going off down the hall, followed by his groan of protest. But from Nora's room, there was silence. She's sleeping in, Diane thought. The poor girl worked so late. Let her rest. Diane had gotten up, had started the coffee, had made Michael breakfast. It wasn't until 7:45, when Nora still hadn't appeared, that Diane had gone to wake her. The empty bed had been the first shock. Made up, unslept in. The second shock had been Nora's backpack missing. Her work shoes gone. Her jacket not on its hook by the door. And then the slow, creeping realization. Nora had never come home. David! Diane's voice had cracked through the house like breaking glass. David, Nora's not here. The next hour had been chaos. Calling the diner. Linda hadn't opened yet, the phone rang and rang. Calling Cassie. She hadn't heard from Nora since school the previous day. Calling the hospital, no Jane does, no admissions. Finally, at 8:20 in the morning, calling the Millbrook Sheriff's Department. I need to report my daughter missing, Diane had said, her voice shaking so badly she could barely get the words out. She worked last night at the Riverside Diner and she never came home. She always comes home. Always. Something's wrong. The deputy who'd taken the call had been kind but cautious. Ma'am, in most cases when a teenager doesn't come home, She's not most teenagers. Diane had interrupted, her voice rising. She's Nora. She's responsible. She wouldn't just not come home. She wouldn't do that to us. Please, you have to help me. By 9 a.m., deputies were at the Gray house. By 9:30, they'd found Nora's car on County Road 14, abandoned on the shoulder, keys still in the ignition. By 10 a.m., sheriff's department phones were ringing off the hook as word spread through Millbrook. Nora Gray was missing. Deputy Tom Brennan, years before he'd become sheriff, had been one of the first responders to the scene. He'd walked around Nora's Honda Civic with Detective Raymond Price, both of them noting the details with growing dread. The car had simply died. They'd later determine it was a fuel pump failure, a mechanical problem that could have happened to anyone. Nora's purse was on the passenger seat, her school books in the back. Nothing appeared disturbed. No signs of struggle, Ray Price had said, his voice grim. But she wouldn't have just walked away from her car in the middle of the night. Someone stopped. Someone offered help. Tom had looked up and down the dark stretch of County Road 14, thinking about his own daughter, only 2 years younger than Nora, thinking about how he'd taught her to be careful, to lock her doors, to not trust strangers, but also thinking about how they'd raised her to believe in the basic goodness of people, in community, in neighbors helping neighbors. How do you teach someone to be cautious and kind at the same time? How do you prepare them for a world where kindness can be a weapon? By noon, the search had begun in earnest. Volunteers flooded the sheriff's department. Teachers from the high school, parents, students, shop owners, farmers. Cassie Morgan had been there with her parents, her eyes red from crying. Mr. Henderson had shown up in his Sunday clothes, looking older than his 73 years. Linda Mercer had closed the diner and brought her entire staff. "We'll find her," people kept saying to Diane and David, who sat in the sheriff's department conference room in a state of suspended horror. "Nora's smart. She's strong. We'll find her." Michael had been kept home from school, had sat quietly in a corner of the conference room with a coloring book someone had found for him, though he was really too old for coloring books now. He'd colored mechanically, his mind trying to process something too big and terrible for a 9-year-old to understand. His sister was gone. His Nora, who made him cookies and helped him with homework and told him stories about the adventures they'd have when they were grown, gone. The search parties had spread out in grids, walking the roads, searching the ditches, calling Nora's name into the November cold. The TV stations from Indianapolis had arrived by mid-afternoon, setting up cameras outside the sheriff's department, interviewing anyone who would talk about the missing Millbrook teen. "She's a wonderful girl," Mrs. Patterson, Nora's English teacher, had said into a reporter's microphone, tears streaming down her face. "Bright and kind and talented. Someone who had everything ahead of her. Please, if anyone knows anything, please come forward." Coach Simmons had organized the volleyball team to make missing person flyers. They'd worked in the school gymnasium, printing hundreds of copies with Nora's junior year school photo. She was smiling, her hair pulled back in a ponytail, her eyes bright. Missing Nora Gray, 17 years old. Last seen November 14th, 11:55 p.m. at Riverside Diner. The flyers had gone up everywhere, on telephone poles, in shop windows, on community bulletin boards. Nora's face multiplied across Millbrook until you couldn't go anywhere without seeing her, without being reminded that someone was gone. Thomas Whitmore had been part of those search parties. He'd shown up Sunday morning, November 15th, with coffee and donuts for the volunteers. "Terrible thing," he'd said to anyone who would listen. "Just terrible. In all my years in this town, nothing like this has ever happened. Makes you wonder what the world's coming to." He'd searched with the others, walking through fields and forests, calling Nora's name. His wife Catherine had been there too, handing out maps and coordinating groups. They'd seemed like concerned citizens, pillars of the community coming together in crisis. No one suspected. Why would they? On Monday, the school had held an assembly. Principal Harris had stood on the gymnasium stage, the same stage where Nora had received her National Honor Society certificate just 2 months before, and had told the students that Nora was missing, that the community was searching, that they should all be vigilant and stay safe. The mood in Millbrook had shifted. Parents who'd previously let their teenagers drive at night now insisted on picking them up. Women who'd walked alone felt eyes on their backs, felt the weight of vulnerability. The sense of safety that had defined small-town life had been punctured, and fear had rushed in to fill the void. Cassie had given multiple interviews to Detective Price, recounting everything she could remember about Nora's last days. She was happy, Cassie had insisted, crying. She was stressed about college applications, but she was happy. She was excited about the future. She wouldn't have run away or hurt herself or anything like that. Someone took her. Someone did something to her. The investigation had moved quickly in those first days. Ray Price had interviewed everyone on Nora's shift at the diner that night. Linda Mercer had provided security camera footage from the diner's parking lot, grainy and dark, but it showed Nora leaving at 11:55 p.m., getting into her car, pulling out onto the road. The dark blue truck had been visible in the footage too, parked near the dumpsters, but the angle hadn't captured the license plate or any identifying details. "Can you tell what kind of truck?" Tom Brennan had asked, leaning over Ray's shoulder as they'd reviewed the footage. "Ford, maybe. F-150 or similar. Dark color, blue or black." Ray had rewound the tape, played it again. "There. You can see it pulls out maybe 30 seconds after Nora does. Could be following her. Could be coincidence. They'd put out a call for anyone driving that route around midnight to come forward. A few people had. A trucker heading to Indianapolis, a nurse driving home from the hospital in the next county, but none of them had seen anything helpful. The night had swallowed Nora Gray, and no one seemed to know what had happened in those dark hours. By Tuesday, the search had expanded to nearby counties. State police had joined the effort, bringing dogs and additional resources. The dogs had tracked Nora's scent from her abandoned car about 40 yards down the road, where it had simply stopped, indicating she'd gotten into a vehicle. "Definitely picked up by someone," Ray had told the family, his face drawn with exhaustion. He'd barely slept since Saturday morning, had been running on coffee and determination. "We're working every angle, checking registered owners of blue Ford trucks in the area, reviewing similar cases in surrounding counties, interviewing anyone who might have information." But leads were scarce. There'd been no witnesses, no forensic evidence at the car, no ransom note or contact from anyone claiming to have Nora. She'd simply vanished, as if the darkness itself had reached out and pulled her away. On Wednesday, November 18th, the community had held a vigil. Hundreds of people had gathered at Riverside Park, holding candles, singing hymns, praying for Nora's safe return. Diane Gray had stood at the front, her husband's arm around her, and had spoken in a voice that barely worked. "My daughter is out there somewhere," she'd said, looking out at the sea of faces, at all these people who claimed to care. "She's scared and she's alone and she needs us to find her. So please, please, if anyone knows anything, if anyone saw anything, come forward. Nora is kind and good and she deserves to come home. She deserves to have the future she's worked so hard for. Please help us bring her home." The crowd had wept. People had embraced. And somewhere among them, Thomas Whitmore had stood with his wife, his candle burning, his face appropriately concerned, carrying a secret that would poison the next 26 years. On Thursday, November 19th, Ray Price had started methodically interviewing anyone who'd been in the diner that night. Mr. Henderson had come in, had shared his conversation with Nora, had cried into his handkerchief and apologized for being unhelpful. Chad Brennan and his friends had been interviewed. They'd been obnoxious, had made inappropriate jokes, but their alibi had checked out. They'd gone to a party after leaving the diner, had been there until 3 in the morning with dozens of witnesses. Ray had also interviewed businesses along County Road 14. Whitmore Construction had been doing work on a housing development about 2 miles from where Nora's car was found. The project manager had provided a list of employees who'd been working in the area. Thomas Whitmore's name had been on that list. "We'll need to talk to him," Ray had told Tom Brennan. "Just standard procedure. Interview everyone who was in the area." Friday, November 20th. 6 days after Nora disappeared. Thomas Whitmore had come to the sheriff's department voluntarily, had been cooperative and concerned. He'd sat across from Ray Price in the same interview room where, 26 years later, he'd sit again under very different circumstances. "I heard about the Gray girl," Whitmore had said, shaking his head. "Absolutely terrible. My daughter's about that age, well, would be if we'd been blessed with children. Can't imagine what the family's going through. We're talking to everyone who was working near County Road 14 last Friday," Ray had explained. "Your company's project is in that area. Can you tell me where you were Friday night, November 13th? "Home," Whitmore had said without hesitation. "Home with my wife. We had dinner around 7, watched some TV, went to bed around 10. Just a quiet Friday night." "You didn't go out at all? Didn't drive past that area?" "No, sir. Like I said, home all evening." Whitmore had met Ray's eyes steadily. "I wish I could be more help. If I'd seen anything, I'd certainly tell you." Ray had noted it all down, had asked a few more routine questions, had thanked Whitmore for his time and cooperation. And then Ray had called Catherine Whitmore, who'd confirmed her husband's alibi without hesitation. Home all night, together, watching television. Nothing unusual. The interview had been filed away. Thomas Whitmore had been cleared. The investigation had moved on. That weekend, the search had continued with desperate intensity. Every abandoned building in the county had been checked. Every body of water dragged. Every known sex offender within 50 miles interviewed and re-interviewed. But Nora remained missing, and hope was beginning to curdle into dread. On Sunday, November 22nd, a deer hunter named Marcus Webb, future deputy, but then just a 23-year-old doing what he'd done every November since he was 14, had been walking through Blackwood Forest, 17 miles from Millbrook. He'd been tracking a buck, had been moving quietly through the trees, when he'd seen something that didn't belong. A flash of red fabric. Nora's work shirt from the diner. Marcus had approached slowly, his stomach dropping with each step, knowing what he was about to find but praying he was wrong. He'd been wrong. Or rather, he'd been right, which was worse. Nora Gray lay partially hidden beneath fallen leaves and branches. Someone's hasty attempt to conceal what they'd done. Her face was turned toward the sky, her eyes closed. She looked like she was sleeping, except for the bruises around her neck, the cuts on her hands, the evidence of violence that Marcus couldn't unsee no matter how many years passed. He'd backed away, shaking, and had called the sheriff's department from his truck. Within an hour, Blackwood Forest was swarming with law enforcement. Crime scene tape went up, photographs were taken, evidence was collected, and Detective Raymond Price stood over Nora Gray's body and made her a promise. "I'll find who did this to you," he'd said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. "I swear to you I'll find them." The call to the Gray family had fallen to Sheriff Martin, Ray's superior at the time. Diane had answered the phone, had heard the words, "I'm so sorry," and had started screaming. Her screams had echoed through the house, through the neighborhood, through the rest of her life. Michael had been in his room when his mother's world shattered. He'd come running, had seen his father holding his mother as she collapsed, had heard fragments. Found her dead. Nora's gone. He'd stood in the doorway, 9 years old, watching his parents break apart, understanding that nothing would ever be the same again. The town had learned within hours. In Millbrook, news traveled like fire, especially tragic news. By evening, the Gray house was surrounded by people bringing food and flowers and useless condolences. The vigil candles in the park were relit, but this time they weren't for hope. They were for mourning. The autopsy had been performed on Monday, November 23rd, the day before Thanksgiving. Dr. Sarah Kim, the county medical examiner, had worked with meticulous care, treating Nora's body with the reverence it deserved. Her findings had been devastating. Strangulation as cause of death, evidence of sexual assault, defensive wounds on Nora's hands and under her fingernails where she'd fought her attacker. She fought hard. Dr. Kim had told Ray Price, her voice heavy. There's DNA under her fingernails, skin cells, probably from scratching her attacker. There's also DNA evidence from the assault. If you can find your suspect, we can match them. But finding the suspect had proven impossible. The DNA had been entered into databases, no matches. The investigation had followed every lead, interviewed hundreds of people, pursued every theory. Ray Price had worked the case obsessively, had sacrificed his health and his marriage to it. But the answer had remained frustratingly out of reach. Thomas Whitmore had been at Nora's funeral, had stood with the other mourners in the cold November rain, had shaken David Gray's hand and told him how sorry he was for his loss. He'd donated money to the scholarship fund established in Nora's name. He'd continued living his life, building his business, being a respected member of the community. And the years had passed. 1999, 2000, 2001. The case had grown cold despite Ray's efforts. Other crimes had demanded attention. The files had been boxed up, stored in archives, gathering dust. Diane Gray had never recovered. She'd continued working at the elementary school library, had continued being a mother to Michael, had continued existing, but some essential part of her had died in Blackwood Forest with her daughter. She developed rituals, visiting Nora's grave every week, maintaining a memorial website, calling the sheriff's department quarterly to ask if there were any updates. There never were. David Gray had grown quieter, more distant. The window seat he'd built for Nora remained in her room, which they'd left largely untouched. Sometimes Diane would find him sitting there, looking out at sunrises Nora would never see. Michael had grown up in the shadow of his sister's murder. He'd become protective of his mother, watchful of his surroundings, unable to fully trust the world. He'd left Millbrook for college, had needed to escape the place where everyone knew him as the boy whose sister was murdered. But he'd come back eventually, unable to stay away from the only place where Nora still felt real. The investigation had been reopened briefly in 2003, when Catherine Whitmore had died and Ray had wondered if she might have been protecting her husband. He'd looked at Thomas Whitmore again, harder this time, but there'd been nothing to find. Whitmore's alibi had held. There'd been no new evidence. The case had gone cold again. In 2015, Ray Price had retired, turning his files over to Detective Sarah Chun with explicit instructions. Don't let her be forgotten. Keep working it. Somewhere there's an answer. Witnesses, as technology improved, had submitted the DNA for new testing as techniques advanced. Sarah had promised, and she'd meant it. She'd reviewed the case annually, had re-interviewed. And finally, in 2025, those efforts had paid off. The day Thomas Whitmore was arrested, Rebecca Stokes had been in her kitchen in Portland, Oregon, making breakfast for her children, when her phone had rung. Detective Chen's voice had been gentle but direct. "Ms. Stokes, I'm calling about an incident you reported in 1998. We've made an arrest in a homicide case, and we believe it may be connected to your assault. Would you be willing to testify?" Rebecca had gone still, the spatula frozen in her hand. She'd spent 27 years trying to forget that night. The man in the blue truck, the terror, the way she'd run through woods not unlike where Nora Gray's body had been found. "It's him," she'd whispered. "You caught him." "We did. DNA evidence. He can't hurt anyone else now." Rebecca had cried then, relief and grief tangled together. "Tell the Gray family," she'd said. "Tell them I'm so sorry I didn't do more. If I'd pushed harder, if the case had been solved." "You survived," Sarah had interrupted firmly. "That's not nothing. That's everything. And yes, you'll testify. You'll help us make sure he never gets out." The day of the arraignment, Millbrook's courthouse had been packed. Diane Gray had sat in the front row, 64 years old now, her hair gray, her face lined with grief and years and the exhausting work of continuing to exist when you've lost a child. Michael sat beside her, 43 now, his arm around his mother, his face hard as he watched Thomas Whitmore enter in prison orange, wrists and ankles shackled. Whitmore had looked older, diminished, nothing like the confident businessman who'd attended Rotary Club meetings and coached Little League. His expensive lawyer stood beside him, already making motions, already building a defense. But the evidence was damning and everyone knew it. The prosecutor, Amanda Chun, no relation to Detective Sarah Chen, had laid out the charges with clinical precision. Murder in the first degree, kidnapping, sexual assault. She'd described the DNA evidence. the pattern established by Rebecca Stokes's assault, the timeline that placed Whitmore in the area when Nora disappeared. "The defendant lived among you for 26 years, Amanda had said, turning to address the packed courtroom. "He built your houses. He coached your children. He smiled at community events. And the entire time, he carried the knowledge of what he'd done to a 17-year-old girl whose only mistake was accepting help from someone she thought she could trust." Whitmore had pled not guilty. His lawyer had argued reasonable doubt, had pointed out that 26 years was a long time, that memories fade, that DNA could be explained in various ways. But his arguments had felt hollow against the weight of evidence. As Whitmore had been led out of the courtroom, back to county lockup to await trial, he'd passed close to where Diane sat. For just a moment, their eyes had met. Diane had stood, trembling, and had spoken in a voice that carried through the silent courtroom. "You took my daughter from me. You took my Nora, who never hurt anyone, who was good and kind and full of light. You don't get to look away. You look at me. You look at what you destroyed." Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Whitmore had looked away anyway, had been moved quickly by deputies, but Diane's words hung in the air long after he was gone. The revelation that Thomas Whitmore had been arrested for Nora Gray's murder sent shockwaves through Millbrook that rippled outward like an earthquake. What had been a close-knit community, proud of its history and its sense of mutual trust, suddenly found itself fractured along lines no one had anticipated. In the days following the arraignment, the divisions became apparent everywhere you looked. At the grocery store, in church pews, at school board meetings, in the comments sections of news articles, Millbrook was having a reckoning with itself. Sarah Chin had expected some of this. She'd worked enough cases to know that when a respected community member was accused of a terrible crime, people struggled to reconcile the person they thought they knew with the evidence of what they'd done. But the depth of the division surprised even her. "Half the town wants to build a statue to you for solving the case," Marcus Webb told her one morning in the break room at the sheriff's department. He poured coffee into 2 mugs, sliding one across to her. "The other half thinks we've got the wrong guy and we're on some kind of witch hunt." "Evidence doesn't lie," Sarah said. But she knew it wasn't that simple. People believed what they wanted to believe, saw what they were prepared to see. The Millbrook Gazette had been covering the case extensively. Editor James Morrison, who'd run the paper for 35 years, had been 13 when Nora was killed. He remembered the fear that had gripped the town, the way parents had suddenly become paranoid, the way Nora's face on missing person posters had haunted everyone's peripheral vision. Thomas Whitmore charged in 1998 murder of Nora Gray. The headline had screamed on the day after the arrest. The article had been factual, careful, laying out the evidence without editorializing. But the letters to the editor that followed had revealed the fault lines. "I've known Tom Whitmore for 40 years, wrote Harold Jensen, who'd worked as a foreman for Whitmore Construction. "He's a good man, a generous employer, a friend to this community. DNA can be wrong. Tests can be contaminated. I pray the truth comes out and Tom is exonerated, because I simply cannot believe he's capable of such evil." Another letter, from Grace Martinez. "Thank you to the Sheriff's Department for never giving up on Nora Gray. My daughter was her age when she died. I've spent 26 years afraid, wondering if the monster who took her was still out there. Now we know he was. Now we know he was living among us the whole time. It makes my skin crawl, but it also makes me grateful that justice, however delayed, is finally coming." The Millbrook High School had held an assembly to address the arrest. Principal Rebecca Foster, who had been a sophomore when Nora was a senior, had stood before students who'd been born years after the murder and tried to explain why this mattered. "Nora Gray was a student here just like you," Rebecca had said, her voice catching. "She walked these same halls, sat in these same classrooms, had dreams about her future just like you do. Someone took that future from her. And now, after 26 years, that person is being held accountable. This isn't just history. This is justice. And it matters." But not everyone had agreed. A group of parents, led by Michael Whitmore, Thomas's cousin, no relation to Diane's family despite the shared last name, had started a petition demanding the charges be dropped, claiming a rush to judgment, prosecutorial misconduct, a vendetta against a successful businessman. Tom Whitmore is innocent until proven guilty, Michael Whitmore had told a reporter from Indianapolis. This DNA evidence is circumstantial at best. Where are the witnesses? Where's the proof he was even with Nora Gray that night? This is a disgrace, and it's tearing our community apart. The petition had gotten 300 signatures. In a town of 8,000, that was significant. But there was another petition too, started by Cassie Morgan, who still lived in Millbrook, who'd become a veterinarian like she'd planned all those years ago, who'd never forgotten her best friend. Her petition called for the town to rename a section of Riverside Park Nora Gray Memorial Park, and to install a permanent memorial to honor not just Nora, but all victims of violence whose cases had gone cold. Nora was my best friend, Cassie had written in the petition's description. She was kind and talented and full of life. Someone took her from us, and for 26 years that person walked free. We can't bring Nora back, but we can remember her, we can honor her, and we can support the pursuit of justice, no matter how long it takes. That petition had gotten 1,500 signatures. Detective Sarah Chun had been receiving calls daily from reporters, from true crime podcasters, from documentary filmmakers, all wanting the inside story. She'd declined most of them, but she'd agreed to one interview with a respected journalist from the Indianapolis Star, understanding that controlling the narrative mattered, that getting the facts out there in a responsible way could counteract some of the conspiracy theories spreading through social media. What broke the case? The journalist, Patricia Moore, had asked during their interview at a coffee shop in Millbrook, her recorder placed carefully between them on the table. Advancements in genealogical DNA analysis, Sarah had explained. The DNA we recovered from Nora Gray in 1998 was preserved carefully, but the technology to analyze it was limited. We could get a profile, but without a match in law enforcement databases, it didn't lead anywhere. Genealogical DNA databases changed that. When a family member of the suspect uploaded their DNA to a public ancestry website, it created a familial match that pointed us toward Thomas Whitmore. From there, we legally obtained his DNA, and it matched the evidence from the crime scene with 99.9% certainty. There are people who say this is an invasion of privacy, that using public DNA databases for law enforcement purposes is problematic. I understand those concerns, Sarah had said carefully, but we followed all legal protocols. We got warrants. We built our case properly. And at the end of the day, we have conclusive scientific evidence linking Thomas Whitmore to Nora Gray's murder. That matters more than privacy concerns about public databases that people voluntarily uploaded their information to. What about the alibi? Whitmore's wife said he was home that night. Catherine Whitmore died in 2003. We can't question her now. But we believe she was either mistaken about the timeline, which is easy to do, especially years after the fact, or she was protecting her husband. We'll likely never know which. There's also Rebecca Stokes's case from 1998. Can you talk about that? Ms. Stokes reported a sexual assault in May of 1998, 6 months before Nora Gray was killed. Her description of her attacker and the vehicle matches Thomas Whitmore. We believe this establishes a pattern of behavior. Ms. Stokes will be testifying at trial. The interview had been published with the headline, DNA and Determination: How Detectives Solved 26-Year-Old Cold Case. It had been widely shared, had brought renewed attention to the case, had sparked new conversations about the role of technology in solving old crimes. Rebecca Stokes had flown to Indiana 2 weeks after Whitmore's arrest. Sarah had met her at the Indianapolis airport, had recognized her immediately from her driver's license photo, though 27 years had passed since that night in 1998, and both women had aged, had lived entire lives in the interim. "Thank you for coming," Sarah had said, shaking Rebecca's hand. "I know this isn't easy. I've thought about testifying for 27 years, Rebecca had said. Her voice was steady, but Sarah could see the cost of that steadiness in the tightness around her eyes. After it happened, after I reported it and nothing came of it, I used to fantasize about facing him in court someday, about making him answer for what he did. I never thought it would actually happen. They'd driven to Millbrook, Rebecca looking out the window at the landscape that had once been familiar. She'd gone to Millbrook College, had been a sophomore that terrible spring. She'd left town after the assault, had transferred to a school in Oregon, had built a life far from Indiana. She'd never planned to come back. "I need to meet her mother," Rebecca had said suddenly as they drove through downtown Millbrook, past the courthouse where the trial would eventually take place. "Diane Gray, I need to tell her I'm sorry." "You have nothing to apologize for," Sarah had said firmly. "I survived. Her daughter didn't. And maybe if I'd done more, if I'd pushed harder for them to investigate." "Rebecca, stop." Sarah had pulled into a parking space, had turned to face her passenger. "You were 19 years old and traumatized. You reported it. You did everything you could. What happened to Nora Gray is not your fault. It's Thomas Whitmore's fault and his alone." But Sarah had understood the guilt, the what-ifs that probably haunted Rebecca's quieter moments. She'd arranged for Rebecca to meet with Diane Gray the next day at the Gray family home, with a victim's advocate present to support both women through what would undoubtedly be an emotionally devastating conversation. The meeting had taken place on a gray October afternoon, the same kind of weather as the day Whitmore had been arrested. Diane Gray's house was modest, well-maintained, filled with photographs of Nora at various ages. Rebecca had stood in the living room, looking at a picture of Nora in her volleyball uniform, and had started crying before anyone had said a word. Diane had embraced her, this stranger who was connected to her through violence and survival. "You're alive," Diane had said, holding Rebecca as they both wept. "You got away. I'm glad you got away." "I'm so sorry about Nora," Rebecca had managed. "I'm so sorry." They'd sat together for 2 hours, talking about that spring and fall of 1998, about the man who'd hurt them both, about the years that had passed since. Diane had shown Rebecca Nora's college essay, the one she'd never finished, the one that talked about becoming who you're meant to be despite the expectations placed upon you. "She would have been amazing," Rebecca had said, reading the words of a girl she'd never met but who felt heartbreakingly familiar. "She was so young. We both were. But you got to grow up," Diane had said, and there was no resentment in her voice, only a kind of fierce joy. "You got to become an adult, a wife, a mother. You got to have the life he tried to take from you. That matters. That's important." Before Rebecca left, Diane had given her something. A small bracelet that had belonged to Nora, silver with a charm in the shape of an artist's palette. "She would want you to have it," Diane had said. "She would want you to remember that you survived, that you mattered, that your life had value." Rebecca had worn that bracelet every day since. The preliminary hearings had begun in late October, and each one had revealed more details about the case. The prosecution had called witness after witness, building their case methodically, piece by piece. Dr. Sarah Kim, now retired but willing to testify, had explained the forensic evidence from 1998. The DNA under Nora's fingernails, the evidence of struggle, the manner of death. "This was a violent crime," she testified. "Nora Gray fought for her life. She left us evidence, and that evidence pointed directly to Thomas Whitmore." The DNA expert from the state crime lab had walked the court through the genealogical analysis that had cracked the case. "The familial match was undeniable," he'd explained. "And when we obtained Thomas Whitmore's DNA independently, it was a perfect match to the DNA recovered from the victim. The statistical probability of this being anyone other than Mr. Whitmore is effectively zero." Marcus Webb, who'd found Nora's body 26 years ago, had testified about that terrible day in Blackwood Forest. "I'll never forget it," he'd said, his voice rough. "Never forget her face, or knowing that someone had done this to her and just left her there. I'm grateful we finally know who." Mr. Henderson had testified too. At 99 years old, he'd had to be helped to the witness stand, but his memory of that last night at the diner was sharp. "She was a lovely girl," he'd said, looking directly at Thomas Whitmore. "Kind and thoughtful. She had her whole life ahead of her. You took that. You took everything." Whitmore's defense attorney, Gerald Morrison, no relation to the newspaper editor, had cross-examined aggressively, had tried to poke holes in the timeline, had suggested that the DNA evidence could have been contaminated or mishandled. But the evidence was solid, and everyone in the courtroom knew it. The most powerful testimony had come from Rebecca Stokes. She'd walked to the stand with her head high, had placed her hand on the Bible, had sworn to tell the truth. And then she'd looked at Thomas Whitmore and had told her story. It was May 15, 1998, she'd begun. I was 19 years old. My car broke down on County Road 14. A man in a blue truck stopped. He seemed nice, normal. He offered me a ride. I accepted. And then he drove me into the woods and attacked me. The courtroom had been absolutely silent as Rebecca described what had happened. How she'd fought. How she'd escaped. I saw his face, she'd said. I've seen it in my nightmares for 27 years. That's him. That's the man who attacked me. During cross-examination, Morrison had tried to suggest that Rebecca's memory might be faulty, that 27 years was a long time, that she might be mistaken. Rebecca had been unshakable. Some things you don't forget, she'd said. Some faces are burned into your memory. I know what I remember, and I know that's him. Outside the courthouse after her testimony, Rebecca had been mobbed by reporters. She'd prepared a brief statement. I'm grateful to Detective Chun and everyone who worked to solve this case. To the Gray family, I'm sorry for your loss, and I hope this brings you some measure of peace. And to any other survivors out there, your story matters. Your testimony matters. Don't be afraid to speak your truth. The public opinion in Millbrook had been shifting. The weight of evidence was overwhelming, and even some of Whitmore's staunchest defenders were beginning to waver. The petition calling for charges to be dropped had stalled. The counter-petition for the memorial park had continued growing. At the Riverside Diner, where Linda Mercer still worked though she was in her 70s now and mostly just did the books, there'd been a steady stream of people coming in to talk about the case. The diner had become an unofficial gathering place for discussing the latest developments, processing the community's collective grief and shock. I served him breakfast 3 times a week for years, Linda had told a reporter who'd stopped by. Tom Whitmore. He always ordered the same thing, eggs over easy, rye toast, coffee black. He was polite. He tipped well. And the whole time he was carrying this secret. It makes me sick. The diner's security camera footage from 1998 had been shown in court. Grainy and dark, but still powerful. Watching Nora walk out of the diner for the last time, alive and unaware, had left many in the courtroom in tears. And seeing that blue truck pull out after her, following her into the darkness, had felt like watching a ghost. Michael Gray had testified about the impact of his sister's murder on his family. At 43, he was now older than Nora would ever be, a fact that struck him every year on his birthday. He'd taken the stand wearing a tie clip that had belonged to his father. David had died in 2018, had spent the last 20 years of his life waiting for answers that came too late for him. My father died not knowing, Michael had said, his voice breaking. He worked at the post office for 35 years, was a good man, a quiet man. He never recovered from losing Nora. It ate away at him, the not knowing. He'd see that window seat he built for her and he'd just break down. My mother. She's stronger than anyone I've ever known. But this has been her entire adult life. 26 years of not knowing who took her daughter. 26 years of seeing that person in the grocery store, at community events, living his life while hers was frozen in November 1998. Michael had turned to look directly at Whitmore. You knew what you'd done. You knew the pain you'd caused. And you just kept living, kept building your business, kept being part of this community. How do you do that? How do you look people in the eye knowing what you've done? Whitmore had looked down at the defense table, had refused to meet Michael's gaze. The preliminary hearings had also revealed something else. Thomas Whitmore had kept a storage unit on the outskirts of town for the past 30 years. When detectives had executed a search warrant on the unit, they'd found boxes of old construction records, some tools, and a locked metal box hidden in the back corner. Inside that box, a single earring, gold with a small pearl, the mate to the one that had been found with Nora's body. Sarah Chun had been present when they'd opened that box. She'd felt her hands start to shake as she'd photographed the earring in place, as she'd carefully bagged it as evidence. He kept a trophy, she'd said to Marcus, who was there as backup. He kept a piece of her. Why? Marcus had asked, his voice filled with disgust. Why keep something that could incriminate you? Because these kinds of killers don't think they'll get caught, Sarah had explained. And because they want to remember. They want to relive it. That earring let him relive what he'd done whenever he wanted. The earring's discovery had made national news. It had been the final piece of evidence that convinced even the most skeptical observers that Whitmore was guilty. You didn't keep a murdered girl's earring hidden in a locked box for 26 years unless you had something to hide. The town of Millbrook had held another vigil on November 14, 2024, the 26th anniversary of Nora's death and 1 month after Whitmore's arrest. This vigil was different from the ones that had come before. It wasn't about hope or uncertainty anymore. It was about recognition, about acknowledgement, about finally naming what had happened. Cassie Morgan had organized it, working with the Millbrook Women's Coalition and the high school's current principal. They'd gathered at Riverside Park at sunset, hundreds of people holding candles, and they'd listened as speaker after speaker honored Nora's memory and spoke about the importance of never giving up on justice. Diane Gray had been the last to speak. She'd stood at the podium with Michael beside her, looking out at the sea of faces. Some she knew, some she didn't, all gathered to remember her daughter. 26 years ago tonight, Diane began, her voice amplified through speakers but still somehow small against the November evening. My daughter went to work at the Riverside Diner. She was 17 years old. She was excited about college, about volleyball regionals, about the future that stretched before her like an open road. She had dreams. She had plans. She had so much love to give to the world. Diane paused, collecting herself. Someone took all of that away from her. For 26 years, I've lived with not knowing who or why. I've lived with questions that had no answers, with a grief that had nowhere to direct itself. But now we know. Now we have answers. And while nothing can bring Nora back, while no amount of justice can fill the hole her absence has left in my life, in Michael's life, in all of our lives, there is something to be said for knowing, for naming what happened, for holding someone accountable. She looked down at the photo of Nora she'd brought with her, the same one from her volleyball uniform, the same bright smile. Nora was not just a victim. She was a person. She was an artist who saw beauty in ordinary things. She was a friend who listened without judgment. She was a sister who made her little brother feel like the most important person in the world. She was a daughter who made her parents proud every single day. She contained multitudes, as her English teacher used to say, and she fought when someone tried to take. On November 14, 1998, 17-year-old Nora Gray was murdered in Millbrook, Indiana. An honor student, volleyball captain, and talented artist, Nora was driving home from her waitressing job at the Riverside Diner when her car broke down on County Road 14. Thomas Whitmore, a respected local construction business owner, stopped to offer help. Instead of assistance, he drove her to Blackwood Forest where he sexually assaulted and strangled her to death. Nora fought desperately for her life, unknowingly leaving crucial DNA evidence under her fingernails. Her body was discovered 3 days later by a hunter. The community was devastated. Detective Raymond Price led the investigation, but despite extensive searches and interviews, the case went cold. The only significant lead was a similar assault 6 months earlier. Rebecca Stokes had been attacked by a man in a blue truck after her car broke down, but she escaped. Her report was inadequately investigated at the time. Nora's family, her parents Diane and David Gray, and 9-year-old brother Michael, were left with unanswered questions and unbearable grief. The Millbrook community held vigils and searches, but the killer remained unknown. The case haunted everyone involved, particularly Nora's mother Diane, who became consumed with finding justice for her daughter. For 26 years, the case remained unsolved. Detective Price worked it until his retirement and died without ever knowing the answer. The Gray family lived in suspended grief, unable to fully heal without closure. David Gray died in 2019, never learning who killed his daughter. Diane continued advocating for the case, maintaining contact with law enforcement, refusing to let Nora be forgotten. During these decades, Millbrook remembered Nora through memorials, scholarships, and community gatherings. Her best friend Cassie Morgan organized annual vigils. The Riverside Diner kept a memorial to her on the wall. Yet the killer walked free, living among them. Michael grew up in the shadow of his sister's murder, struggling with depression and the trauma of loss. The case defined his entire life and shaped his identity. By 2024, he was married with 3 children, all of whom knew their aunt only through stories and photographs. Detective Sarah Chun, who'd taken over cold cases in Millbrook, decided to use advances in forensic genealogy to re-examine Nora's case. The DNA evidence from under Nora's fingernails had been carefully preserved. Using genealogical databases, investigators identified familial matches that led them to Thomas Whitmore. In October 2024, police obtained Whitmore's DNA from a discarded coffee cup. It was a definitive match. On October 28, 2024, Whitmore was arrested, a moment of shock for the entire community. The respected businessman, now 74, had lived openly in Millbrook for decades after killing Nora. He'd maintained his construction business, had a family, and appeared completely normal. The arrest fractured the community. Some people struggled to believe Whitmore was guilty, having known him for years. Others felt betrayed that a monster had hidden in plain sight. His adult sons were devastated, having grown up with no idea of their father's crimes. The trial began February 10, 2025. The prosecution, led by Amanda Chun, presented overwhelming evidence. The DNA match with statistical probability of error less than 1 in a trillion, Rebecca Stokes's testimony about her own assault, and a trophy earring found in Whitmore's storage unit that matched one found with Nora's body. Rebecca's testimony was particularly powerful. She'd never forgotten her attacker's face, and seeing Whitmore again confirmed what she'd always known. Her courage in coming forward connected the 2 cases and established Whitmore's pattern of predatory behavior. Nora Gray testified about the devastating impact of losing Nora. 26 years of grief, unanswered questions, and her husband dying without closure. The emotional weight was overwhelming, but the evidence was irrefutable. Whitmore never testified or showed remorse. His defense attorney Gerald Morrison had no real strategy against the DNA evidence. After 11 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a guilty verdict on March 2, 2025. At sentencing in April, Judge Margaret Foster gave Whitmore life without parole. The verdict brought complex emotions. Relief that justice had finally come. Anger that it took 26 years. Grief that Nora never knew her killer would be caught. But there was also a sense of validation. Diane's decades of advocacy had mattered, Nora's fight in those final moments had mattered, and the evidence had been preserved long enough for technology to catch up. The community began healing through various initiatives. In June 2025, Millbrook dedicated a memorial statue in Riverside Park showing Nora as she was young, creative, full of potential. The Nora Gray Memorial Scholarship was established, supporting art students for generations. The high school incorporated the case into curriculum, teaching about forensic science and the importance of believing victims. Rebecca Stokes became a national advocate for assault survivors and cold case reform. She partnered with the Cold Case Foundation, helping solve over 100 cases nationwide. Her message was consistent. Speaking your truth matters, and evidence preserved today might bring justice years later. Detective Sarah Chun continued investigating other potential victims. By summer 2025, DNA evidence connected Whitmore to 3 additional murders: Jennifer Walsh, 2002, Angela Torres, 2007, and Michelle Patterson, 2011. All followed the same pattern: vulnerable young women, offers of help, rural locations, violent deaths. Whitmore was charged with these murders as well. Psychological experts analyzed his ability to compartmentalize, living as a respected businessman while being a serial predator. Dr. Patricia Simmons explained that such individuals separate different aspects of their personality, allowing them to function without apparent guilt. Keeping Nora's earring for 26 years demonstrated he'd never felt remorse. He wanted to remember what he'd done. The revelation that Millbrook had harbored a serial killer for decades was devastating. Sarah Chun identified 17 possible cases between 1985 and 2015 that might connect to Whitmore, though proving them would be difficult due to age and evidence degradation. Diane Gray channeled her grief into advocacy, working with legislators to pass Nora's Law, comprehensive cold case reform requiring better DNA evidence preservation and funding for testing old cases. The legislation passed with bipartisan support in 2026, ensuring other families might find answers even decades after crimes occurred. Michael Gray wrote Living in the After, a brother's memoir, exploring how trauma shapes families and the long journey toward healing. The book resonated with many experiencing unresolved trauma and became a resource for families of murder victims. Thomas Whitmore died in prison in 2036 at age 88, having served 15 years. He never confessed or expressed remorse. His death was noted briefly and then he was forgotten, exactly what he deserved. 3 decades after the conviction, the case's impact continued rippling through generations. Emma Gray Rodriguez, Michael's daughter and Nora's niece, became a successful artist. She received the Nora Gray Memorial Scholarship and created powerful works exploring memory, loss, and resilience. Her 2033 solo exhibition featured a portrait of Nora that asked, "What is a life? How do we measure impact? What remains when someone is gone?" Diane Gray lived to see much of this legacy unfold before passing peacefully in 2038 at age 86. She testified for Nora's Law, seen hundreds of students supported by the scholarship, and witnessed her grandchildren carry forward Nora's memory through art and advocacy. She was buried beside David and Nora, family reunited. By the 50th anniversary in 2048, Nora's story had become embedded in Millbrook's identity, taught in schools and commemorated annually. The memorial statue remained a sacred space for anyone dealing with loss. The Cold Case Foundation had helped solve over 500 cases. 50 trees were planted in the memorial park, one for each year since Nora's death, ensuring her memory would live through multiple generations. Michael's youngest daughter, Lily, became a victim's advocate, directly inspired by her family's journey. Rebecca Stokes, though elderly, continued sending messages about Nora's enduring impact. Emma's own grandchildren played in the memorial park, representing the continuation of family and story beyond tragedy. Nora Gray's story demonstrates that justice, however delayed, matters profoundly. Her courage in fighting her attacker preserved evidence that would take 26 years to decode but ultimately caught a serial killer. Her death inspired legislative reform, supported hundreds of students, and created a framework for how communities can honor victims while pursuing truth. The case proved that with preserved evidence, advancing technology, and determined investigators, even decades-old cold cases can be solved. It showed that survivors who come forward, like Rebecca Stokes, play crucial roles in bringing predators to justice. And it demonstrated how tragedy can be transformed into purpose through advocacy, art, and the refusal to forget. 50 years after her death, Nora Gray remained present, not just as a victim, but as an artist, a fighter, and an inspiration. Her bronze statue sat unchanged in the memorial park, face turned toward light, forever young, forever remembered. As Emma whispered to the statue, "You mattered so much," and the evidence of that mattering extended across 5 decades, touching thousands of lives, proving that some names are never forgotten and justice is always worth pursuing. The revelation that Thomas Whitmore was a serial killer who'd lived among them for decades forced Millbrook to confront uncomfortable truths about trust, safety, and human nature. Church services became forums for discussing justice and mercy. Pastor Williams held special sessions where community members could process their feelings of betrayal, guilt for having trusted Whitmore, and confusion about how they'd missed the signs. Many residents experienced a form of collective trauma. People who'd hired Whitmore Construction felt complicit, wondering if their money had somehow enabled his crimes. Parents who'd allowed him around their children felt retroactive terror. His neighbors, who'd chatted with him over backyard fences for years, questioned their own judgment. The psychological impact rippled through social networks, creating divisions between those who immediately accepted his guilt and those who struggled to reconcile their memories of good neighbor Tom, with the monster revealed by DNA evidence. The case became a cautionary tale about the banality of evil. Whitmore wasn't the Hollywood version of a killer, wild-eyed and obviously disturbed. He was ordinary, pleasant, helpful. This ordinariness made him more terrifying because it shattered the comforting myth that monsters are easy to identify. Dr. Patricia Simmons's explanation of compartmentalization helped some people understand, but it didn't erase the fundamental unease. If Whitmore could hide in plain sight, who else might be doing the same? A crucial but often overlooked aspect of this case was the meticulous evidence preservation that made justice possible 26 years later. Detective Raymond Price, despite having no solution, had ensured that Nora's fingernail scrapings were properly stored and documented. The evidence technician in 1998 had followed protocols precisely, creating a clear chain of custody that would survive decades of scrutiny. This attention to detail, motivated by Price's conviction that somehow technology would advance enough to read what the evidence contained, proved transformative. In many cold cases from that era, evidence was lost, contaminated, or improperly stored. The Nora Gray case demonstrated the critical importance of treating every piece of evidence as potentially case-solving, even when current technology cannot process it. Sarah Chen's decision to revisit the case using genealogical DNA techniques represented a new frontier in forensic investigation. She'd attended conferences, studied methodology, and understood that what seemed impossible in 1998 had become routine by 2024. Her persistence in applying for grants to fund the genealogical analysis, her willingness to learn new investigative techniques, and her respect for the victim and family drove the breakthrough. James and Robert Whitmore, Thomas's adult sons, became collateral victims of their father's crimes. They'd grown up with seemingly normal childhoods, little league games, homework help, family dinners. Their mother, Catherine, who died in 2016, had never known she'd married a serial killer. The sons' discovery that their entire understanding of their father and childhood was built on lies created profound psychological damage. James's op-ed in the Indianapolis Star revealed the complex grief of being related to a murderer. He described feeling like he'd lost his father twice, once to the truth of what he'd done, and again to the prison system. He wrote about the guilt of existing as the child of a monster, wondering if something genetic might lurk within him, terrified of having children who might inherit whatever darkness had consumed his father. Both brothers entered intensive therapy. They struggled with whether to visit their father in prison. Neither ultimately did. They changed their names to distance themselves from the Whitmore legacy. They donated portions of their inheritance to victim support organizations. Yet they couldn't escape the fundamental question. How do you grieve for someone who's alive but dead to you? How do you reconcile loving childhood memories with the knowledge that while you were being tucked into bed, your father was planning or remembering murders? Their experience highlighted an often ignored aspect of violent crime. The perpetrator's family becomes victims too, suffering a unique form of grief and shame that society rarely acknowledges with compassion. Rebecca's transformation from victim to national advocate represented one of the case's most powerful narratives. After her 1998 assault, she'd suffered PTSD, struggled with relationships, and carried guilt about being unable to identify her attacker conclusively at the time. When Whitmore was arrested for Nora's murder, Rebecca's testimony became crucial. It established his pattern, his methods, his predatory nature. But testifying meant reliving her trauma publicly. In pretrial preparation, she worked with prosecutors and victim advocates, practicing her testimony, preparing for the defense attorney's inevitable attempts to discredit her. The courtroom experience was harrowing. Seeing Whitmore again, being cross-examined about the worst night of her life, having her memory questioned. Yet something shifted during her testimony. Speaking her truth publicly, being believed, watching the jury's faces register horror and compassion rather than doubt. These experiences became catalytic. She realized her voice had power. Her survival had meaning. She could help others. Her memoir, After the Blue Truck, became required reading in many criminal justice programs. She spoke at conferences about the importance of believing victims, about how inadequate investigation of her assault might have prevented Nora's death if Whitmore had been caught earlier. She advocated for better victim services, better evidence collection protocols, and reform of how sexual assault cases are investigated. She also worked directly with families waiting for cold case resolutions, offering a unique perspective as both survivor and advocate. She understood the limbo of not knowing, the explosion of relief and grief when answers finally came. Her friendship with Diane Gray demonstrated how trauma could create unexpected bonds and how supporting each other could facilitate healing. Emma Gray Rodriguez's journey represented the generational transformation of trauma into creation. Born 30 years after Nora's death, Emma grew up with her aunt as a presence, talked about constantly, memorialized, elevated to near-mythic status. But Diane and Michael were careful to keep Nora human in Emma's understanding, sharing not just the tragedy but the personality, the humor, the ordinariness that made her real. Emma's art explored themes of absence and presence, asking what it means to know someone only through stories and photographs. Her solo exhibition, Inherited Memory, examined how trauma passes through generations, how we carry stories of people we never met, how art can be both memorial and resurrection. The centerpiece painting Nora, 1998, used a technique where viewers saw different images depending on their distance from the canvas. Up close, it appeared fragmented, painful, broken. From across the room, it resolved into a coherent portrait of a young woman full of life and potential. Emma explained this was intentional, representing how perspective and time change our understanding of tragedy, how distance can reveal patterns invisible in grief's immediacy. Receiving the scholarship bearing Nora's name created responsibility for Emma. She felt she was creating not just for herself, but as continuation of Nora's interrupted artistic journey. When she became a professor at RISD, she established a special workshop for students dealing with trauma and loss, teaching them how to transform pain into creative expression. Nora's law became model legislation adopted by 17 states by 2045. The law mandated specific protocols for DNA evidence preservation, created dedicated cold case units with adequate funding, and established regular review schedules for unsolved cases. It also allocated resources for genealogical DNA analysis and required law enforcement training in new forensic techniques. The legislation's impact was measurable. Hundreds of cold cases were solved in its first decade. Families who'd waited decades for answers finally received closure. Killers who'd thought they'd escape justice found themselves arrested in their 70s and 80s, their lives built on freedom ending in prison cells. But the law also sparked important conversations about privacy, ethics, and the use of genealogical databases. Some worried about genetic surveillance, about relatives being unwittingly involved in investigations through their DNA. These concerns led to additional regulations protecting privacy while maintaining investigative utility. The case also influenced forensic science education. Universities created programs specifically focused on cold case investigation techniques. The Nora Gray case became a teaching example in criminal justice courses worldwide, demonstrating both the potential of forensic genealogy and the importance of methodical, patient investigation. The bronze statue and memorial park evolved into something beyond commemoration of a single victim. It became a pilgrimage site for families of murder victims, a place where people dealing with unresolved grief came to sit and reflect. The bench beside the statue bore witness to countless tears, whispered prayers, and quiet contemplations. Local therapists sometimes brought clients there as part of grief counseling. High school students wrote essays there for English class. Artists sketched the statue. Photographers captured it in different seasons and lights. The memorial transcended its original purpose, becoming a community space for processing all forms of loss. Each anniversary, people left offerings, flowers, sketches, handwritten notes expressing their own grief and hope. The notes revealed how Nora's story resonated. "My sister was murdered too. Thank you for not giving up. I'm starting art school next fall. This is for you, Nora. Justice delayed but not denied. Hope for my family." The 50 trees planted on the 50th anniversary created a living memorial that would outlast everyone involved in the case. As those trees grew, some reaching heights of 30 feet within a decade, they became symbols of how life continues, how growth happens even in ground fertilized by tragedy, how beauty can emerge from the darkest soil. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel.